And it doesn't mean you didn't learn anything, and it doesn't mean you did learn something. It just means that an employer can't tell the difference.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And the more you just sound like everyone else, the more I would doubt that you did learn something.
That word lozenge, there's something about that.
Oh, totally. Who wants a lozenge?
Lozenge. It just sounds bad.
Do you have a salve or a lozenge you can give me?
Moist, preferably.
Do you have a moist salve or a moist lozenge you can hand over? My throat's parched. I need something moist. A salve or a lozenge or something like that. Oh, God, yeah.
Miley's eyes.
The rolling.
It's great.
You know what? This is how we know we have a cohesive team. Miley and Kiera have now finally found coping mechanisms to put up with the three of us. I think that's powerful.
It is.
That might be actually one of the best mission mindset skills they've employed. What are we going to do? Look, we need to record this thing. How do we do it? Just ignore them. Just let them be weird. Don't take their lozenge.
Lozenge.
Okay, so we're back. Today, we're getting close, actually, to the end of this first section of video, so that's exciting, kind of lay the foundation. But we want to talk a little bit more about story. We've referenced that at various points, and that's pretty important to the work we do here. One of the things that I often say is that if school is your only skill, then student is the only job you're qualified to do. And another way of saying that, that's often the way we talk about it, another way of saying that is that if college is the only, or school is the only story you have, then, that you will not stand out from anyone else in the same way. So story is our stand-in not only for talking about what we say to other people, but how we kind of make sense of whatever we've experienced. And that's the starting point for why that's important in the work that we do. But I feel like it's something that is probably best understood by hearing people's stories. So, we thought it'd be a good idea to just kind of think about some of the challenges that we've seen students face in understanding their own story and kind of dig into those a little bit. So, school does give people a chance to practice storytelling in a very kind of school-specific way, like a group presentation where you go up to the front of the classroom and kill everyone with your PowerPoint. But that, and then we often pretend like that teaches people to communicate well. So we spend a lot of time talking about how to tell stories well, which is really about understanding the audience. But even prior to that, I think we've learned that people have to figure out what story it is they want to tell before they even get to the point of telling it well. And what school does is give you that content of a story.
Yeah, but it gives you the wrong confidence, right?
It gives you the wrong confidence. You can practice and master at some level. And master seems like an extreme overstatement there, but that master for the sake of school storytelling, right? Reciting content in a familiar way. So some of the problems, though, when we try to take that method and take that storytelling out into the world with an audience that doesn't care about school for its own sake, then it doesn't work. Then not only do you find yourself lacking in the telling and making that relevant to the audience, but also in the content itself. And so I think we see a few things in that space. For one thing, as we mentioned, if the only story that you have is essentially your transcript, I was a blank major. That's all you have to say about college. And that's not nothing. You really were a blank major. You're just one of, a million of those every year. And that is pretty much the same story everyone else has. So how do we get beyond that? How do we find out what other stories we can tell that could go along with being that major or that also happened while you're in college? And secondly, to understand that there are other stories in there that, 4 years or 5 years or however long has passed, something happened to you. So how do you figure out what stories you can tell about that time, whether they're academic or not, that are meaningful to other people? And then third, kind of how to decide or how to choose which of those potential stories that you have. And so I think that's kind of the progression for us on the simplest version of the progression on the story side, to understand you need something more than school, to understand that there are other stories that you have. And then as you progress in getting better at that, how do you pick which one? How do you frame them? How do you choose which, version of the story or which story to tell in different circumstances? And so that's a very simplified version of how we work with story in the beginning with students. And that's all really related to early career and how so the assumed audience in this case really are employers or potential professional connections. That's who we're thinking about telling our story to. But maybe starting with some of our own experiences about first kind of getting past just school as the story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we see some similar trends in the issues with story, especially working with students, right? Liz, I know you've got good ones. We all do, but you were talking about one the other day that was, when you said it, I'm like, wow, that feels like a very common student experience.
Totally. Well, I was just thinking about how, you can approach an internship or a first job with this sort of school mindset and not really know how to translate your experiences and tell that story about what you did in a way that's meaningful for other people. And so, I can think of so many students who would come in and say, hey, like I did this internship. And I would say, like, what did you do? And they'd be like, I don't know. I just did some office work. And, they couldn't, I think it was hard to grasp what they were really getting out of it and how to pitch it in a way, even to an advisor who's they're just meeting with to talk about what that experience means. I think in a student's mind, I got an internship, so I've achieved something. And so that'll get me in the door for a job. But if you're not able to articulate what you got and what you did in that internship, then it doesn't really mean anything. Just like your major doesn't really mean anything to employers. And I certainly had students that interned with our office that they were just there. I couldn't write a recommendation about them, not because they weren't great students, but because they didn't really know how to build a story in that opportunity, I think is the way I would describe it. So sort of well, I don't really know what I would say about this person. I can't write a letter of recommendation for you about this because, I think you just need some more work. You need some more challenges that you need to overcome before we could write anything about what you did and how you contributed. And that's tough because, you're tired and you think, I don't know, I just remember students taking on a lot and you think, I got this internship, doesn't that mean something?
Yeah,
but
I did it. Everyone told me this is what I should do.
Yeah, but it's not just a box. I don't know. Does that resonate with either of you and your experiences?
By challenges, do you mean the students were approaching it kind of passively, waiting to be told what to do?
Yeah, totally. I think, and just give me the list of what my chores are, what are my assignments?
Where's my work syllabus?
Yeah, exactly. And then that just made more work for me as an internship supervisor, trying to think about how do I make this a learning moment for them. But that wasn't helping me really. No. It was more work on my end as an internship supervisor. So
I was told by someone who had an internship over the summer, at kind of an orientation event with a lot of higher ups in the company. I think a student in the Q&A literally asked them oh, what's the syllabus or something along those lines. So work syllabus, they quite literally asked those questions, I think.
Yeah, this is spoiler alert. If you get a college degree, the jobs you get should not have syllabi. We tell that to people all the time. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah.
It's funny because that sort of every story is ubiquitous. We've heard that from employers directly, right? So I might have even mentioned this earlier in one of our discussions, but we've met with different folks at different levels of recruiting. This is a very high up level in charge of college internship programs for a large software company here in the Seattle region. And we were meeting with her and we were talking about what stands out when she's got, a short amount of time to look at resumes and go through things. And I said, I was giving my best, right? Oh, I was a humanities major. I know how to communicate well and think outside the box. I have a global perspective. I understand the complexity of humans. And she just said, so does every humanities major. Next, what do you have? I said, well, I've studied abroad and I've, learned to live with discomfort. She goes, so has everybody. Next. And she was just going through the list of things that I had been sort of reinforced as believing those were so valuable as part of my school aspect. And she just could not differentiate that because they were ubiquitous. And I think we've talked about this. If that degree was so powerful of a pre-professional experience, we would have employers lining up and saying, we need all of your Spanish majors. We need all of your English majors. We need all of your philosophy majors. I'm not saying those are all great degrees, but it's not the content of the degrees that separates individuals in terms of hiring. And I think for students who fall back on the story of just their major, they run into trouble, which maybe some people here can speak to.
Yeah, I could totally speak to that. Again, I think in past episodes talked about I didn't have a lot of internship or job experience, so anything outside of school. And then school is just a very integral part of my identity and my skill set. I was good at doing school. So I really didn't feel like I had a story outside of school. And so that was my story. I leaned into it, being a linguistics major, a UW student, or just even good student, I guess. So I probably tried to go the route of talking about like transferable skills or saying, okay, linguistics means I'm good at languages, communication. I didn't have proof really. It was just me saying like, I'm in this major. These classes help me develop these skills. But that was the story. I go to class, I learn things about language, and then I wasn't able to translate that to an employer if I were to go to interviews or other outside of school opportunities. So that was hard.
But that's how we benefited, right? That's how Maile finally took the leap and said, okay, I'm going to do something to add to my story, which is gesture and us. So and I got to say, too, I've heard this from a parent. It was a parent and family weekend a few years back. We gave a presentation, and I talked about how, the story of your UW experience has to be something other than just your degree and what you major in. A parent came up and said, well, why am I paying all this tuition for all these classes and all these things? I said, well, that's important. That signifies a lot of other things to employers. Earning the degree, and we've mentioned this before, is super important, but you have to have a story beyond just degree.
Yeah.
So there's that's one category of stories we keep talking about, sort of everyone's story is just school. We've also talked about, people who have had no story, right? And they just struggle with that. That came up in boot camp with us one time.
Well, for me personally, I feel like I had no story. I don't know if that was necessarily true, but, when people would ask you questions like, tell me about yourself, for like an interview or just in general, like, what are you doing in college? But in boot camp specifically, there was a prompt where we were supposed to share a failure story. So essentially, when have you made a mistake? When have you failed at something?
And that's a complicated question, actually. Yeah.
And common. It comes
And very
up in
common, yeah.
interview questions. So a very good question to have an answer prepared for. But that really was a difficult question for me to answer because I didn't think I had a story, much less a failure story. So
Well, you'd obviously never failed at school, which is how you got into UW. And
yeah, I mean, I think again because I figured I was a good student. So hold on, actually.
Do you want a cough drop?
No, I'm okay. I think
Okay.
You just want to be on the cough
Okay.
track. Everyone needs to be on the cough track.
Yeah.
in boot camp, there was a prompt to share a failure story, and it was supposed to be everyone on the team shared the story, so it was kind of a bonding moment in a way because failure stories are hard to share, maybe emotional, maybe personal. But it was difficult for me because I felt like I didn't have a story, much less a failure story. I remember sitting there for a long time trying to figure it out. And there's the common didn't get into my major story. I think I don't know if I ended up telling that or not. A lot of students, most people in my group would say, I didn't get into this major. I didn't get into computer science or any of those capacity constrained majors. Or like I failed a test, I didn't get a good grade, or maybe even I failed the whole class. So that was a very common story. So then once I kept, working in the program as a manager, I also had to tell a story too, just not as a student, because we all shared a failure story in that moment. But I kept trying different stories each round we did it because I didn't feel like my story was very good. And I was struggling to figure out what other stories I had. So I might have shared one about not doing well in like a spelling bee. I think I was the first person out in my class, and I don't know, that was pretty embarrassing, but I don't really know if that really counted or, so I really struggled with trying to find a story. Even just like tell me about yourself, any of those sort of questions about who I was that wasn't related to being a student.
And I think that's super common, right? Especially with not a lot of work experience. And so again, I think gesture and our work brings people back into, learning how to identify stories and tell them. It's super complicated. So your struggle is definitely shared with lots of others. But there's also another sort of genre of story, telling the story that everyone has, not having a story, or then sometimes not actually being aware of the stories that do have capacity. And I feel like this is also honed in on some of our more recent work. But I remember, because Kiera and I worked together in boot camp early on, and I knew she was a great student, and I knew all these other aspects about her academic side, which were super strong, but it didn't lean into the professional side until we started learning more about work experience. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I remember that Meet Your Manager meeting. Right before it, I looked up how do you meet your manager, of course. I think for everything on there, I looked up everything.
Just like typed it into Google.
Yes.
How do I talk to a
And
manager?
it probably said talk about your experiences. And I think one of the first mistakes I made is I wasn't really thoughtful about that. I was just kind of like, I'm going to throw everything I can think of at Matt in like a 3-minute long monologue, probably. I think that's how it went.
Okay.
And I think it was okay in that I did have some experience around the confectionery and being a fig leader. And I think I sprinkled those in, but I didn't really consider them to be professional experience. If I'm remembering correctly, I probably spent more time talking about my majors and what skills I thought I was gaining from them because I assumed that would be considered more professional than those other activities I did for whatever reason. I mean, I didn't even really have a reason why. I thought that I just assumed anything associated with school would be more professional.
Right.
And then I ended up getting feedback that wasn't true, that you told me I should be emphasizing more about leadership, and I have these important stories about customer conflicts that I could talk about. And I realized I just wasn't even, for one, choosing skills thoughtfully, but also I was focusing on the wrong stories. I was so focused on my majors and hoping that the confectionery or being a fig leader would just kind of help boost that part of me and say, I did do something.
Right.
Instead of actually being important stories to talk about.
Well, and then one thing, the same recruiter at said large local software company, when we got through my crestfallen news that all of my humanities hard work and endeavors were, anonymous and sort of ubiquitous for anyone who had studied that, I said, what are you looking for? And she started saying things like, well, customer service, food service, barista, camp counselor, nanny. I'm sitting there thinking, wow, these are the things that stand out. But you immediately have a context, again, to Kevin's earlier point of your audience. And Kiera, I think you just reiterated that as well. If you're just sitting there and putting together a 3-minute monologue about the best of myself as conceived of myself in the vacuum of thinking just to myself, it could be the wrong story. And in fact, a lot of times it might be, especially when you're not practiced in that. And so that recruiter or head of summer internships told us those sorts of things where I know there was stress involved. I know there were pressures. I know there were conflicts and difficulties and challenges. It's a loaded term here with gesture, but those were part of it. And I think that was one thing that really struck me is that our students need to lean into that and hearing that they might have some stories that have more traction outside of school that are not school stories.
Yeah, and there's like a mentality for how you engage in opportunities that that can shift too. I mean, I'm just thinking about the the few students that stand out as like really excellent interns that I worked with in my last job, they figured out like what the possibilities were, and they like dug into that and tried things and then would communicate those ideas well. And it was like, oh, I could easily write a letter about this person because they just really thought about this as an opportunity and they wanted to make an impact and engage deeply. And I think some people just come by that naturally, but it's really easy to take on opportunities and not think about what your audience is and what your impact could be, and click into that mindfulness about how you engage with the world,
Oh, completely.
You've had a great Starbucks barista and you've had one that wasn't so great, and you can tell the difference.
Yeah, I feel like it just adds to the complexities around story. And going back to how Kevin started us off today, if I were a student listening to this and thinking about, okay, where do I go? Where do I start? So what comes next? Like, how do you start? Where do you start on your story practice?
Well, I think we've hit on a lot of challenges that students face and also some of the myths about story, right? And so multiple people mentioned actually that some version of if you can't tell the story, then it didn't happen, right? Which I think is true. And that the variant that we often hear in higher ed, and I think if you hear somebody say this, you should be suspicious, even though I have said it in the past, you should have been suspicious at the time. Students just need to learn to articulate what they've learned. And that, honestly, the more I've thought about it, that's just BS. I think, they do need to learn to articulate things. But if you can't articulate it, then I don't think you learned it. Right? And so I don't know now you're just making up stuff. And so that, to your point, Miley, we know that a linguistics major is supposed to be about X, Y, and Z. And so we just say, I learned X, Y, and Z, which you may have or you may not have, but everyone knows that that's what it's supposed to be. So you're just regurgitating. I'm not trying to be critical of you, but that's all you're doing, Miley. You're just regurgitating. You're just regurgitating the things that we know about, that major or that degree or about college, which is not an irrational strategy, right? Like you're trying to tap in. You're basically saying, I don't really know what to say, but I'm going to just try and tap into the things that you probably think are important, which we should point out is the value that some professional degrees have.
Yep.
Because professional degrees, people think they teach it. Well, actually, any degree, if everyone thinks this degree teaches you something and you get that degree, it doesn't matter whether you actually learn that. It just matters that everyone thinks you learn that. And if no one thinks you get anything out of this degree, then you better have a pretty good story because they're just going to assume that you didn't learn anything. And to Matt's point, study abroad may broaden people's horizons. But if everyone says the exact same thing about it, which just sounds like whatever's on the website about study abroad, then you're just going to sound like everybody else. And it doesn't mean you didn't learn anything, and it doesn't mean you did learn something. It just means that an employer can't tell the difference.
Right.
And the more you just sound like everyone else, the more I would doubt that you did learn something, actually. And so story is, so I think that notion of, part of it is sort of confusing the event for the story. So the event is the thing that happened in the past. And maybe you learned something, maybe you didn't. And the story is how we make sense of that. And that can change over time. The story is what we make in the present, right? That's what we talk about in the present. So we can change the way we thought about something that happened in the past. And when we're older, we'll tell a different story. And we're talking to somebody else, we'll tell a different story. None of those things change what actually happened. But in the grand scheme of things, nobody necessarily cares about what actually happened because they weren't there and they don't know it. What they care is about how you're making value out of that, that thing that happened in the past. And so I think that's where the discrepancy by saying, oh, well, you were a poli-sci major, you must have learned about X. Well, okay, maybe not. That may, if you can't talk about it, then I'd say you probably didn't learn it. But that doesn't mean that you can't reconstruct something now, looking back on what did happen to you or what other experiences you had and tie those together and upon reflection, create a story. That's not the same thing as just going back in time and describing the learning that you forgot somehow. That is, in some ways, just learning it in the present. And so the work we do, Matt, to your point, is to try and not just go back and mine experiences to find some nugget that somebody has, most people do have some nuggets in retail experience, in job experience, in community work, in family experiences, and just things that happen to you. They could be good things, they could be bad things, it could be in classes, whatever it is. But I mean, stuff has happened. We know that. It's not going back, just finding the thing and telling that. It's going back, finding the nugget that you can now create a new meaning around. And that's where it depends on the audience. Who are you talking to? What's important to them? The other thing we say is that, okay, we say a lot of things. Another thing that we say, so many things, I don't even remember what I said. Even a story about me, a great story about me is one that the audience feels like is about them. And that is true. The core of our work on story is it has to be about the other person, the person you're talking to. And the content we may draw from our own experiences, often we will. At some level, we always will. But the trick is to make it feel like it's about them. It's important to them. It creates value for them. And so the method that you allude to, Matt, I think, we have figured out a way that we think works to help people develop these story skills. It's definitely not perfect, but we've figured out enough that we can kind of walk people through workshops. Part of it was in boot camp. Part of it was in, the early version of boot camp. There's a little bit in externship and other programs we've run. So there's been little bits along the way, but our goal now is to kind of, let's build out the actual sort of story method that we use. That is first about figure out the content and then figure out the audience and then work on the skills to make that content about the audience. So we'll go into talk about that a little bit more. I'd say the most important thing is that it's a hard thing to learn, and it's like one of those what do they say about Chad? Like takes. Okay, I shouldn't have quoted something. I don't actually know what the quote was. Takes a lifetime to master.
10,000 hours, or
that's right. I was thinking of the thing where it like takes a day to learn and a lifetime to master. Is it a day though? I got stuck on the day. Is it take a day, an hour? You learn it fast, but then I don't know.
A moment to learn, a lifetime to master.
That's a good one. Let's go with that.
Okay.
Anyway, it's like that. It's like
I
what
just
you
sold
said.
that to Hallmark, by the way.
We'll trademark that.
Okay.
Anyway, it seems easy, but it's actually hard, and you're actually going to have to practice it over time. It has to become a habit and a way that you engage with the world. So we tried to just say, hey, here's how you do story. And then people would go, oh, that's great. Let me go try it. And then it never worked because you have to do it regularly and get constant feedback. So now our plan is let's build a framework that we can bring people in and they can continue to engage with us over time. So we'll talk about some things on the videos and in the podcast, but really it'll be through workshops and through activities that we do with people in person or possibly online, but in an ongoing fashion. So that's exciting. We have something to recruit people into our Hallmark things that we're just making up on the spot.
If you made it this far and you're still listening, good
and
chance that
probably
would
like
benefit.
a family member
Or you know too much already.
Yeah.
Insider. We're like the card we're just selling.
Yeah.
It takes a moment to see us. It takes a lifetime to understand us.
well, it's such a common thing to feel like, how do I package myself up here for other people? And I think that idea of like figuring out who your audience is and like what the right thing is to share with them. Like I'm sure there were some general things that employer that you talked about, that recruiter had in her mind about how people would talk about Starbucks or, being a nanny. But like, figuring out the right things that apply to most audiences so that you enhance your employability across a wide range of opportunities. Like that's.
I feel like our next episode is teed up to really, the bait has been set. How do you tell these stories? Where do you find them? So next time, let's talk more about it.
Yeah, we got to leave something for the next episode. And we are, I think, as I mentioned, we're getting to that. I think when we get through that episode and lay the foundations really for our method, that will really be a transition point where we can then start to talk about some of the applications of this method. What does it look like really to think about and critically think about, let's say, what a major is or what the path through college is or how you should actually take advantage of opportunities or think about failure or challenge differently. So once we have kind of the terms, we can kind of dig into particular topics.
Are we getting picked up for season 2?
It's, you got to wait for the boss people to look. But okay. I think we might have ruined it with the bugs and the
the
Hallmark
lozenge
stuff. We try to come back with a lot, yeah.
We'll be better.
All right. So see you next episode or possibly never again. Goodbye.